Welcome back to The Explainer. So let's just dive right in today because we are looking at a genuinely fascinating pivot point in history. Imagine this. In an incredibly short span of time, a collection of nomadic tribes from the Arabian Peninsula sweeps out and conquers massive chunks of the known world. I mean, it's a stunning military achievement, but it immediately begs a much bigger question. How do you actually govern a sophisticated global empire when your background is rooted in the simple, patriarchal life of the desert? Well, today we're going to break down the administrative and social structures that laid the absolute foundation for medieval Arab civilization.
Because this right here, this is the million-dollar question. You've conquered the ancient world, now how do you run it without losing your own identity? The early caliphs, and particularly Caliph Umar, were facing a massive problem of scale. They had just inherited vast, cosmopolitan territories from the Byzantine and Persian empires. We're talking millions of people, ancient traditions, and super complex economies. Umar needed immediate, pragmatic solutions to adapt the uncodified rules of a tribal society to an entirely unpredicted reality.
So here is our blueprint for today. We'll look at the military commonwealth, the status of the protected, funding the new empire, the first Islamic census, and finally, the birth of Arab civilization.
All right, part one, the military commonwealth.
Think of Umar's constitution almost like a highly disciplined startup strategy, and it was built on one absolute foundational rule. He organized the Arabian conquerors into a pure religio-military commonwealth. Basically, the Arabs were set up to be a ruling military aristocracy, and to maintain that status, they were expressly forbidden from holding or cultivating landed property anywhere outside the Arabian Peninsula. Why? Well, because farming ties you down. Omar wanted his people focused absolutely and exclusively on the state's military mission. They had to be an army in action at all times.
And here's how they practically pulled that off. Instead of just moving into the luxurious, established cities of the territories they conquered, which, let's face it, might make them soft or assimilate them way too quickly, the Arab soldiers set up shop in brand new, separate military cantonments. We're talking places like Al-Jabiyah, Hims, Al-Kufa, Al-Basra, and Al-Fustat. Now, in the beginning, these were barely even cities. Al-Kufa, for example, was initially built just out of reeds used as barracks. The whole goal was to keep the soldiers physically separate, to preserve that tight-knit tribal discipline, their martial readiness, and the purity of the Arabic language itself.
Moving on to part two, status of the protected.
Okay, so if your ruling class is completely isolated in military camps, how on earth do you manage the millions of diverse, conquered people actually living and working in the empire? The answer lies in the concept of the dhimmi, or people of the book. These were non-Muslim subject peoples, primarily Christians, Jews, and Sabians, who belonged to scriptural religions. Under Umar's system, they were brought under the direct protection of the Islamic State. It was a really crucial, highly pragmatic classification. It allowed vastly different faiths to coexist, and more importantly, it kept the empire's economy running smoothly.
So how did this relationship actually play out day to day? Well, the dhimmis had a very specific social contract. The state guaranteed the protection of their lives and their property. Plus, because the Muslim army was strictly an exclusive religious institution, dhimmis were completely exempted from military service. In exchange for all this, they paid a heavy tribute. But honestly, the most vital piece for keeping the empire stable was partial autonomy. Dhimmis were allowed the jurisdiction of their own canon laws. They were administered by their own religious heads in all matters that didn't directly involve Muslims. It was decentralized, outsourced governance at its absolute finest.
Which brings us to part three, funding the new empire.
Think about it. You might have all the land in the world, but if your entire ruling class is forbidden from farming and they're constantly out on military campaigns, how do you actually pay them? The answer was a brilliantly organized dual tax system. First, you have the jizya. This is a poll tax, essentially a tax on the person, levied specifically on able-bodied non-Muslim males in a lump sum. Then you have the kharaj, which was a land tax paid in installments, often in kind right from the produce of the soil. Now, in the very early days of the conquests, these two terms were kind of used interchangeably just to mean tribute. But over time, the administration refined them into this exact, clever distinction, taxing the person versus taxing the property.
But this wasn't just some blind cash grab. The administration was remarkably structured. The jizya tax applied strictly to the able-bodied. They built sweeping exemptions right into the system to protect the vulnerable. Women, children, the elderly, the sick, and even monks and beggars were entirely exempt from this tribute, unless, of course, they had their own independent source of income.
And that leads us to a really fascinating concept called fi. As new territories were conquered, the land itself generally wasn't just carved up and handed out to individual soldiers as private property. Instead, it became the common property of the entire Muslim community. Think of it like a giant state endowment. The folks already cultivating these estates stayed right there on the land, working it and paying their land tax into the public treasury. And whatever revenues were left over after paying the common expenses of warfare and administration, that had to be divided up among the Muslims.
Part 4. The First Islamic Census.
Now, when you have a system where the entire conquering population is entitled to a cut of the state's revenue, you suddenly face an immense bureaucratic nightmare. I mean, how do you track who gets what? Consider the massive sum of 12,000 dirhams. To distribute the spoils of this huge empire, Caliph Umar established the Diwan, a system of public registers that they actually borrowed from the Persians. Every single member of the Muslim community was put on this register to receive a state stipend. And sitting at the absolute top of this list was the Prophet's widow Aisha, who was granted an incredible pension of 12,000 dirhams a year.
So let's see how this builds across the rest of the society's hierarchy within the Diwan. The fascinating thing is, priority wasn't based on aristocratic birth. It was based entirely on your relationship to the Prophet and how early you converted to Islam. You've got the Prophet's family at the top. Next, the early immigrants and supporters pulling in 4,000 to 5,000 dirhams. Down at the bottom, your ordinary everyday Arabian warriors received about 500 to 600. Even women, children, and non-Arab clients of the tribes were registered for 200 to 600 dirhams. And to actually make this massive payroll work, Umar had to conduct the very first formal census recorded in Islamic history.
And finally, Part 5. The Birth of Arab Civilization.
So we've just seen Umar's strict, uncompromising attempts to keep the Arabs totally isolated in their military camps, pure and unmixed. But history has a really funny way of subverting strict plans, doesn't it? I absolutely love this quote from historian Philip K. Hitti. Theirs was another instance in which the victor was made captive by the vanquished. The Arabs were sons of the desert, sure, but they had just fallen heir to the oldest, most highly developed cultures in the world across the Fertile Crescent, Persia, and Egypt. And they had a voracious appetite for learning. When they walked into magnificent cities like Damascus and Alexandria, they didn't just conquer them. They viewed, they admired, and they eventually assimilated the art, philosophy, and science of the very people they had just defeated.
And this brings us to a massive realization. What we casually call Arab civilization was not entirely Arabian in its origins. It was, fundamentally, a brilliant cultural synthesis. The primary Arabian contribution was their blood, and, crucially, the linguistic vehicle, the Arabic language itself. But the real intellectual, architectural, and scientific meat of the civilization, that was actually the rich, hoary heritage of Syro-Aramaean, Persian, and Hellenistic cultures, all adapted, mixed, and expressed totally anew through the medium of Arabic.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. How does a shift in governance from simple desert camps create a cultural synthesis that transforms the world forever? The early caliphs started out with sheer military pragmatism, building separate camps, letting local populations run their own affairs, establishing a massive public payroll just to keep things functioning. But in doing so, they inadvertently created an engine for one of the greatest cultural fusions in all of human history, building an empire that would soon stretch all the way from the Atlantic to the borders of China. It's a real testament to the lasting power of administrative adaptation. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the world we know today.